The city of Oakhaven was a place of steel, glass, and indifference. To the wealthy who glided through its streets in tinted windowed cars, it was a playground of opportunity. But to Zola, a young woman whose heart was as vast as the savannah, the city felt like a predatory beast waiting to swallow her whole. On this sweltering Monday morning, Zola stood before the towering glass monolith of the Grand Central Bank of Prosperity. Her world was crumbling. Her mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her on a small plot of ancestral land, lay dying in a sterile hospital bed. The diagnosis was grim, but the cure was simple. A surgery that cost a fortune Zola did not have. With her knuckles white as she gripped a tattered folder containing her mother's medical records and a dusty land deed, Zola took a breath that tasted of exhaust fumes and desperation. As she stepped into the bank's lobby, the sheer opulence of the place hit her like a physical blow. The air conditioning was a sudden, icy shock against her skin, which was still warm from the long trek from the outskirts. Zola's feet were bare, covered in a fine layer of red African dust, because her only pair of sandals had snapped 3 miles back. She felt every eye in the lobby burning into her. The floor was made of white marble so polished it looked like still water, reflecting the golden chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like frozen stars. Zola felt like a stain on this perfection. Her clothes were clean but faded, and her hair, though neatly braided, bore the scent of the wood smoke from her village. The security guards moved toward her with a synchronized precision that suggested she was a threat to be neutralized. They didn't see a daughter fighting for her mother's life. They saw a nuisance who didn't belong in a temple of capital. "I need to see the manager," Zola whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of 1,000 unshed tears. The receptionist, a woman whose face was as frozen as the bank's temperature, didn't even look up from her gold-trimmed computer screen. "Loans are by appointment only, and we don't handle walk-ins of your kind," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension that felt like a slap. But Zola did not move. She couldn't. Behind her, she could almost hear the rhythmic, struggling breath of her mother. Before we witness the heart-wrenching confrontation that followed, it is truly incredible to think about the journey this story is taking. It is fascinating how the English language acts as a universal bridge, allowing a story born from the deep roots of our culture to resonate with people across the globe. Whether you are watching from the vibrant streets of Lagos, the historic centers of London, the bustling cities of America, or the industrial heartlands of Germany, stories of human courage and sacrifice bind us all together. I am curious to know, from which corner of the world are you joining us today? Are you in the motherland, Africa, or watching from abroad? Please, drop your flag and your city in the comments below. Your presence here makes our global family stronger. Zola's refusal to leave created a ripple of discomfort among the wealthy clients. They shifted in their leather chairs, whispering about the girl with the dirty feet. Finally, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, and Mr. Sterling stepped out. He was a man who wore his power like a weapon, his suit costing more than Zola's village earned in a year. He walked toward her, not with empathy, but with a calculated irritation. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her bare, dusty feet on his pristine marble. "This is a place of business, not a shelter," Sterling declared, his voice booming. Zola stepped forward, holding out her folder. "Please, sir, my mother is dying. I have land as collateral. I just need a loan for the surgery." Sterling didn't even touch the documents. He swiped them aside, sending the medical reports fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. "That land is worthless to us, and you have no credit, no status, and evidently no shoes," he sneered. Zola knelt to pick up her mother's papers, her tears finally splashing onto the marble. But as she looked up at him, a flicker of something dark and twisted appeared in Sterling's eyes. He saw her desperation as a game. "If you really want this money," he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "if you really claim to love your mother that much, perhaps we can make a deal. But it's a deal that a lady like you might find quite humbling." Zola stared at him, unaware that she was about to face a trap that would test the very limits of her soul. Mr. Sterling stood over Zola, his shadow stretching across the polished marble like a dark stain. He watched with a twisted sense of satisfaction as she gathered the scattered papers of her mother's life. To Sterling, the world was divided into 2 types of people: those who owned the gold and those who were broken by it. He saw Zola's desperation not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to exercise the absolute power he craved. The silence in the lobby was oppressive. The wealthy clients had stopped their hushed conversations, their eyes fixed on the scene like spectators at a Roman arena. Zola stood up, her legs trembling, but her gaze fixed firmly on the man who held her mother's fate in his manicured hands. "Tell me the condition," Zola said, her voice a hollow whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "If this money will save my mother's life, there is no price I won't pay. My pride is a small thing compared to her breath." Sterling smiled, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. He slowly walked toward a large, unsightly patch of mud near the entrance, left behind by a careless delivery man. Then, he looked at Zola's dusty feet and back at the mud. "You see, Zola," he began, his tone mockingly conversational. "Loans are built on trust and value. You bring neither to this table. However, I am a man who appreciates a good performance of loyalty. I want to see how much you truly value this dying mother of yours." Sterling gestured to the vast expanse of the marble floor, then pointed at the colorful, hand-woven shawl draped over Zola's shoulders. It was a beautiful piece of fabric, vibrant with the patterns of her tribe, passed down through 3 generations of women. "My condition is simple," Sterling announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You will clean this entire lobby, but you will not use a mop or a bucket. You will use that rag you call a shawl. You will do it on your knees, and for every person who walks through those doors, you will bow and apologize for your pathetic appearance. If every inch of this floor shines like a mirror by the time we close, I will sign your loan. If you fail, or if you stop to rest, you leave with nothing." A gasp rippled through the staff. Even the frozen-faced receptionist looked away, unable to meet Zola's eyes. The shawl was more than clothing. It was Zola's dignity, her history, and her connection to her ancestors. To use it to scrub the filth of the city off a floor while being mocked was a psychological torture designed to crush her spirit. Zola felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the shawl, then at the cruel, expectant face of Mr. Sterling. The injustice was a fire in her veins, but then, the image of her mother's pale face under the hospital lights flashed in her mind. She could almost feel her mother's cold hand in hers. Before we see if Zola can endure this ultimate test of her character, I want to take a moment to welcome you back to our community. These stories are a reminder that true strength isn't found in a bank account, but in the depths of our souls. If you believe that Zola's courage is a light in this dark world, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Your support helps us keep the fire of our heritage burning and ensures that stories of justice and truth reach every corner of the globe. By joining us, you become part of a family that values humanity over gold. Now, let us return to that tense moment in the bank where a young woman's heart is about to be put through the furnace. Zola took a deep, shuddering breath. She slowly reached up and untied the shawl from her shoulders. The fabric felt warm, almost alive, as it slid through her fingers. She didn't say a word. She didn't argue. With a grace that made Sterling's smirk falter for a split second, Zola dropped to her knees on the hard, cold marble. She folded the sacred cloth into a scrubbing rag and pressed it against the floor. The first stroke left a wet, dark streak on the white surface. Sterling let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "That's it! Get to work, beggar girl! Let's see if your love is as strong as your back!" Zola began to move. Centimeter by centimeter she scrubbed. Her knees began to ache almost immediately, the cold stone biting into her skin. Tears blurred her vision, falling onto the floor and mixing with the grime she was cleaning. Every time a customer entered, she paused, lowered her forehead to the ground, and whispered the apology Sterling had demanded. Some people laughed, others looked away in shame, but nobody moved to help her. In the shadows of the far corner, an old man sat quietly, his eyes narrowed as he watched the manager's cruelty. He didn't speak, but his hand tightened around his wooden walking stick until his knuckles turned white. The trial had begun, and the bank had become a theater of shadows. The rhythmic sound of fabric scraping against stone was the only melody in the cold, cavernous hall of the Grand Central Bank. Zola was now halfway across the lobby, her movements slow and deliberate, like a priestess performing a grim ritual. Her knees were bruised, and her hands were raw from the friction, but she did not stop. Every time she felt her strength failing, she closed her eyes and saw her mother's face. She imagined her mother's smile, the way she used to sing while tending to the fields, and the desperate need to hear that voice again pushed Zola forward. Mr. Sterling paced back and forth nearby, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the parts of the floor Zola had already polished. He seemed to take a perverse joy in walking just inches away from her fingers, occasionally dropping a bit of ash from his cigar onto the clean marble just to watch her scrub it away again. "Apologize!" Sterling barked as a wealthy businessman in a silk suit entered the bank. Zola paused, her forehead touching the cold floor. "I am sorry for my presence, sir." "May your day be prosperous," she whispered, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. The man didn't even look at her. He stepped over her arm as if she were a piece of discarded trash. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the exhaustion racking her body. Her sacred shawl, once a vibrant tapestry of her family's history, was now a blackened, soggy mass of filth. It felt like her heart was being dragged across the floor with it. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, Zola's spirit remained unbowed. She wasn't just cleaning a floor, she was carrying the cross for her family's survival, and that purpose gave her a terrifying kind of beauty. In a quiet corner of the lobby, sitting on a high-backed velvet chair that seemed to swallow his small frame, was the elderly man who had been watching from the start. His name was Elias Vance. To the average observer, he looked like a grandfather waiting for a ride, dressed in a simple, faded tunic and holding a plain wooden staff. But Elias was far from ordinary. He was the man who had founded this very bank 40 years ago, built on the philosophy that a bank should be the heartbeat of its community. He had long since retired from daily operations, leaving the management to men like Sterling, whom he now realized were snakes in expensive suits. Watching Sterling mock the young woman made Elias's blood boil with a righteous fury he hadn't felt in decades. He saw in Zola the same grit and integrity that had allowed him to build his empire from nothing. Sterling, noticing the old man staring, wandered over with a smirk, assuming Elias was just another witness to be impressed by his authority. "Quite a show, isn't it?" Sterling whispered, leaning toward the old man. "It's important to remind these people that they can't just walk in here and expect a handout. If she wants our money, she has to earn it through absolute submission. It sets a standard for the rest of them." Elias looked up, his eyes sharp and piercing, cutting through Sterling's arrogance like a blade. "A standard, you say?" Elias replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The only standard I see being set here is one of cowardice. You are mistaking a person's desperate love for weakness, Mr. Sterling. That is a mistake that often costs a man everything." Sterling let out a nervous, dismissive laugh. "You're a romantic, old man. This is the real world. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a beggar to finish breaking." By the time the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows through the high windows, Zola reached the final corner. She was shivering from the cold air and the physical toll of the labor. Her hands were stained black, and she looked like a shadow of the woman who had entered that morning. She stood up slowly, her joints popping, and faced Sterling. The entire staff had gathered, sensing the climax of this cruel game. "I have finished," Zola said, her voice echoing with a haunting dignity. "The floor is clean. I have apologized to everyone. Now give me the loan. My mother is waiting." The silence was absolute. Sterling walked to the center of the room, inspected the sparkling floor with a cynical eye, and then reached into his pocket. He pulled out the loan agreement Zola had seen earlier. He held it up for everyone to see, a small smile playing on his lips. Then, without a word, he began to tear it. He tore it slowly, once, twice, and then into dozens of tiny pieces. Zola's eyes widened in horror. "What are you doing?" she screamed, reaching out. Sterling let the scraps of paper flutter to the ground like snow, falling onto the very floor Zola had just spent hours cleaning. "I've changed my mind," Sterling said, his voice cold and devoid of any mercy. "A woman who is willing to degrade herself like this clearly has no self-respect, and if you have no self-respect, you have no character. This bank does not lend to people without character. Now, get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Zola fell to her knees, a cry of pure agony escaping her lips. But just as Sterling turned to walk away, the sound of Elias's staff striking the floor 3 times rang out like a clap of thunder. The sound of Elias's staff hitting the marble floor was not just a noise, it was a declaration of war. The vibration seemed to travel through the very foundations of the bank, silencing the cruel laughter of the staff and freezing Mr. Sterling in his tracks. Zola, hunched over the scraps of her destroyed hope, looked up through a veil of tears. She saw the old man in the corner rising from his chair with a grace and power that belied his frail appearance. Sterling spun around, his face reddening with anger. "You again? I told you to stay out of bank business, old man. Guards, get this senior citizen out of here along with the girl," Sterling shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden, unexplainable nervousness. But the security guards, who usually jumped at Sterling's every command, stood perfectly still. They were looking past Sterling, toward the entrance, where a fleet of black sedans had just screeched to a halt. "The only person leaving this building in disgrace, Mr. Sterling, is you," Elias said, his voice no longer a rumble, but a roar of absolute authority. At that moment, the heavy glass doors swung open, and a man in a sharp navy blue suit rushed in, followed by a team of lawyers and auditors. This was Julian Vane, the current CEO of the banking group and one of the most powerful men in the city. Sterling's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. "Mr. Vane, sir, what a surprise. We weren't expecting an audit until next month," Sterling stammered, his hands shaking as he tried to adjust his tie. He hurried toward the CEO with a fawning, pathetic smile, but Julian Vane didn't even acknowledge his existence. Instead, the CEO walked straight to the elderly man with the wooden staff and bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Grandfather," Julian said, his voice filled with genuine apology, "I came as soon as I received your signal. I am deeply sorry you had to witness such filth in the house you built with your own hands." The lobby went deathly quiet. The realization hit the room like a tidal wave. The old man in the corner was Elias Vance, the legendary founder of the Grand Central Bank, a man who had disappeared from the public eye years ago, but who still held the controlling interest in the entire financial empire. Sterling's knees buckled. He looked at the girl he had just humiliated, then at the man who could erase his entire career with a single nod. He realized that the trap he had set for Zola had actually been a noose around his own neck. Elias stepped forward, his eyes burning like hot coals as he looked at the shredded loan agreement on the floor. "Julian, look at this young woman," Elias ordered, gesturing toward Zola, who was still kneeling, confused and trembling. "She came here in her darkest hour, seeking help for her dying mother. She offered her land, her sweat, and her dignity. And this man, this excuse for a manager, forced her to scrub our floors with her family's sacred shawl. He made her beg and apologize for the crime of being poor, only to rip up her hope in front of a cheering crowd." Julian Vane looked at Zola, his expression shifting from shock to a deep, burning shame. He looked at the black, ruined fabric in Zola's hands, and then at Sterling, who was now sweating so profusely he looked like he had stepped out of a rainstorm. "Is this how we treat our people now, Sterling?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Is this the standard you've been setting while I was away? You didn't just break bank protocol, you violated the very soul of this institution." Sterling began to babble, trying to explain that Zola was a high-risk applicant and that he was just protecting the bank's image. But Elias cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Silence. A man who finds joy in the suffering of others has no place among decent people, let alone in a position of trust. Julian, I want this man stripped of his title, his bonuses, and his access to this building immediately. And I want a full forensic audit of his branch. Men like him always leave a trail of stolen crumbs." Two security guards, finally moving, stepped forward and grabbed Sterling by the arms. They didn't treat him with the respect he had demanded all morning. They handled him like the garbage he had proven to be. "You can't do this! I have a contract!" Sterling screamed as he was dragged toward the exit, but his cries were ignored by everyone. The wealthy clients who had previously mocked Zola now looked at their expensive shoes, unable to meet her eyes. They were ashamed of their silence, ashamed that a barefoot girl had shown more courage and character than all of them combined. Elias turned back to Zola, reaching down to help her up. His touch was no longer that of a stranger, but of a protector. "Child," Elias said softly, "your trial is over. You have proven that your heart is made of a gold that this bank could never afford." Zola looked at the fragments of the loan on the floor, and then at the powerful men standing before her. "But my mother, the surgery, there is no time left," she choked out, her heart still racing with fear. Elias smiled. a warm and genuine expression that finally brought a sense of peace to the room. He turned to Julian. "Forget the loan. A loan is for strangers. This young woman has paid for her mother's care with a currency far more valuable than paper. Julian, arrange for the best medical transport. I want her mother moved to the private wing of the university hospital. Every cent, every procedure, every medicine, it is to be paid for by the bank as a small restitution for the insult she suffered here today." Zola let out a sob, but this time it was a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The atmosphere inside the Grand Central Bank had transformed from a tomb of cold indifference into a sanctuary of justice. Zola stood in the center of the lobby, her bruised knees still trembling, but her head was held high. The pieces of the torn loan agreement lay at her feet, like the shed skin of a past life. Mr. Sterling was gone, dragged out in disgrace, and with him, the suffocating cloud of arrogance that had filled the building. Elias Vance looked at the young woman before him with a depth of respect usually reserved for kings and queens. He didn't see a girl in rags. He saw the living embodiment of the values he had founded his empire upon. He turned to the CEO, Julian, and spoke with a voice that brooked no argument. "The surgery starts today. I want the finest surgeons, the best recovery suite, and a private nurse for this young woman's mother. No expense is to be spared." As the bank's staff rushed to fulfill the founder's orders, Julian Vane stepped toward Zola, his expression one of deep humility. "Zola, please accept my personal apology," he said softly. "A bank is supposed to be a pillar of the community, a place that builds dreams, not one that destroys dignity. What happened here today was a failure of leadership, and I promise you, it will never happen again." He then turned to the remaining staff. "Effective immediately, the Barefoot policy is abolished. From this day forward, every person who enters these doors is to be treated as a VIP, regardless of what is on their feet or in their pockets. If I hear of a single person being mocked for their poverty, the manager of that branch will follow Mr. Sterling out the door." Zola was escorted to a waiting luxury vehicle, the very same type that had intimidated her only hours before. As she sat in the back, her hands still stained with the dust of the lobby, she looked at her ruined shawl. It was no longer a beautiful garment. It was a blackened, wet rag. But as she touched it, she felt a sense of peace. She had traded her pride for her mother's life, and in doing so, she had won both. The ride to the hospital felt like a dream. Upon her arrival at the elite university clinic, she was met by a team of medical professionals who treated her with the utmost care. Her mother was already being prepared for the procedure. The look of confusion on her mother's face turned into a weak, beautiful smile when she saw Zola. "I told you, Mother," Zola whispered, kissing her forehead. "The ancestors would not leave us alone in the dark." The surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours where Zola sat in the waiting room, no longer barefoot, as Elias had arranged for soft shoes and clean clothes to be brought to her. When the lead surgeon finally emerged, he was smiling. "The procedure was a complete success. Your mother is a fighter, Zola. She will be back on her feet within the month." Zola fell back into her chair, the weight of the world finally lifting off her chest. She wept, not out of sorrow this time, but out of a relief so profound it felt like a spiritual rebirth. She realized that the dusty path she had walked to the bank had been leading her exactly where she needed to be. Justice had not just been served, it had been overflowing. A few days later, Elias Vance visited the hospital. He brought with him a document, but it wasn't a loan agreement. It was a deed of trust and a scholarship grant. "Zola," he began, sitting by her mother's bed, "I've seen many things in my 80 years, but I have never seen a heart as pure as yours. This bank owes you more than just medical bills. We are creating a foundation in your name to help young entrepreneurs from your village. And for you, I want you to join our executive training program. The world needs bankers who know the value of a tear and the weight of a sacrifice." Zola's mother reached out and took Elias's hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. The girl who had walked into the city with nothing was now the architect of her community's future. As we reach the end of this incredible journey, let Zola's story be a permanent reminder in your heart. Never judge a book by its cover, and never mistake humility for weakness. The very person you look down upon today might be the one the universe has chosen to test your soul. In the end, Mr. Sterling lost everything because he valued paper over people, while Zola gained everything because she valued love over herself. True wealth is not found in the marble of a bank lobby, but in the integrity of the human spirit. If this story touched you, please remember to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to know that light always triumphs over darkness. Thank you for being part of the African Folktale Nation family. Until the next moon rises and a new story begins, stay blessed, stay kind, and keep the fire of our heritage burning bright. See you in the next tale.